Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we'll be tackling something that's so relevant right now with how much the music industry is changing, and that is the mental health challenges faced by intersex and transgender artists.
Definitely.
We've got a really fascinating article here from TATANKA, Music Meets Mission, they call themselves.
Yeah.
And it's all about how these artists are navigating the industry and the unique pressures that they're facing. So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. This is a conversation we need to be having. It's not just about music, it's about understanding the human experience behind the art itself.
Totally.
Yeah.
And what really struck me was how this article dives right into the discrimination.
Yeah.
Like, we're not even talking subtle bias here. This is about how the industry itself can be structured in a way that puts up these barriers.
Right. And those barriers are often very deeply rooted in what the article calls cisnormative standards. So basically this idea that the music industry, like many other industries, often favors artists who fit into traditional gender roles. Think about it. Who gets signed? Who gets the radio play? Who gets put on magazine covers?
Right.
Those decisions, even subconsciously, can really reflect larger biases.
Absolutely. And it's not even just about who gets ahead. It's how are they treated once they're there.
Exactly.
The article specifically mentions misgendering, which unfortunately is something that many intersex and transgender artists face regularly.
Yeah, imagine pouring your heart and soul into your music only to have your identity be the focus of critique and not your talent. It's so invalidating, and it just has such a huge impact on mental well-being.
It's just this constant pressure to conform, to be accepted, to be seen as legitimate. And then on top of that, the article brings up the lack of representation,
Right.
which just compounds that feeling of isolation.
It's that feeling of being the only one, even within a larger community.
Yeah.
And without those visible role models, people who have successfully navigated those challenges, it can be so easy to feel like you just don't belong, or that success on your own terms is just completely unattainable.
Right. And that isolation, as the article points out, can have very real consequences. We're talking anxiety, depression, even pushing artists away from their passion altogether.
And this is where it gets even more complex. Because for many intersex and transgender artists, music isn't just a career path.
Right.
It's a form of self-expression, sometimes even therapy.
Definitely.
So when that very outlet becomes a source of stress and anxiety because of how you're being treated, it just creates this really, really difficult situation to be in. It's like this double-edged sword, right? Music becomes both an escape and a source of vulnerability. And as the article points out, that vulnerability can actually lead to another layer of pressure, this expectation to become like a spokesperson for an entire community.
Right. Because they're open about their experience through their art, there's this assumption that they have to also be educators or activists on top of everything else.
Exactly. And that's a really heavy burden to carry, especially when you're still navigating your own journey, your own mental health.
Yep.
Where do you draw the line between using your platform for good and, protecting your own well-being?
It's a lot to ask of anyone,
Yeah.
let alone artists who are already grappling with all these other challenges that we've been discussing. And this actually reminds me of something I read recently about algorithms and how they can actually amplify these biases. Apparently, some music streaming services, they have algorithms that actually make it harder for artists from marginalized groups to be discovered.
That's so fascinating and concerning. We often think of technology as this neutral thing.
Right.
But the reality is it can really reflect and even exacerbate existing inequalities.
Totally.
And that brings us to another critical point, that the article raises access to mental health support. Because even when intersex and transgender artists recognize that they need help, finding it can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, the article uses the term culturally competent care. What does that mean exactly, and why is it so important in this context?
So culturally competent care essentially means finding a therapist or a counselor who truly understands the unique experiences and challenges faced by intersex and transgender individuals.
Okay.
It's someone who gets it. They don't make assumptions. They create a space that's free of judgment.
Right.
Unfortunately, as the article points out, that kind of care is not always easy to find.
So you could be facing all these barriers within the industry, finally reach a point where you're ready to seek help, and then you encounter the same biases and lack of understanding in the healthcare system.
Exactly.
It's so frustrating.
It's heartbreaking. It really is. And the article mentions that this lack of culturally competent care can lead to misdiagnosis, ineffective treatment,
Wow.
even a sense of dismissal from therapists who just aren't equipped to help.
Yeah. It's like this vicious cycle, and it really makes the article's emphasis on community-based resources and peer support networks so crucial.
Absolutely. Finding those spaces, those communities, it can be a lifeline.
Totally. Because like you said, finding those spaces, those communities can be a lifeline.
Exactly. And the article specifically calls out online platforms and these digital communities as being incredibly important, especially for artists who might be geographically isolated or lack access to those local support systems.
Right, like if you're the only person in your town who identifies this way,
Yeah.
it's so much harder to find those connections.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and it makes you realize how important something as simple as connecting with someone who understands your experiences can be.
Finding your people, your tribe.
Yeah, and what I think is so interesting is that the article doesn't just focus on the challenges.
Right.
It also really highlights how these very artists are using their art and their platforms to drive positive change.
Absolutely.
There's a line in here that I really, really loved. It says, promoting well-being through art and community. And it talks about how collaborative projects, for example, can become these incredible spaces of support and creative expression.
It's about turning that shared experience into something so powerful and something that not only benefits the artists themselves, but it really helps to shift the entire culture of the industry as a whole.
Yeah, and it's not just about creating safe spaces. It's also about challenging those cis-normative standards that we talked about earlier,
sure.
right? Like pushing back against that idea that there's only one way to be successful in music. And the article points to a few artists who are doing just that. Like they're breaking down these barriers. They're using their voices to advocate for themselves and others.
It's amazing.
And ultimately changing the landscape of the industry.
Yes.
Which I think is a great note to end on because it shows that while the challenges are very real and systemic, so is the resilience, right? And the power of these artists to create a more inclusive and equitable future for themselves and everyone who comes after them.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to all of us, not just within the music industry,
Right.
that we all have a role to play in supporting and amplifying marginalized voices.
So, to our listener, we'll leave you with this. How can you be more conscious of these issues? Not just as a music fan, but in your everyday life.
Yes.
In your own community.
How can we work to dismantle those barriers and create spaces where everyone feels seen and heard and valued for who they are?
Because ultimately, I think that's what this all comes down to.
Yeah.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, to pursue their passions, and to share their gifts with the world no matter who they are.
I love that.
And on that note, that's a wrap on another deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.